Ladies and gentlemen, today is June the 2nd, 2024, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello?
Yo.
Hey, how are you?
Solid. We started the subathon yesterday, so we're non-stop streamer jail until the timer runs out.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Doing one of those again, huh?
Yep. Been doing them about 2 a year, so once every 6 months. It's pretty fun.
Gotcha.
Yeah, we've done a lot of different things. There was a StarCraft tournament over the weekend, and Zerg ended up winning, which is good if you're a Zerg and you like seeing us win. So that was a plus. And then we had a very funny, obvious news item for the week. No doubt we'll get to that. Also, Baldur's Gate would be a fun thing we can mix in. I think I put that on one of the goals here. You would obviously get paid extra for being a guest.
Oh, Baldur's Gate.
Yeah.
Yeah, you texted me about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do I need to fire it up?
Not right now. I think this week we have a lot of drama. I think next week we could Baldur's Gate at this time. If you want. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah, let's see, where do I have it? Yeah, it's at 2150, so it's a ways down, but...
Did anybody recommend Sins of a Solar Empire 2?
I think you did, but I don't know if anyone else mentioned that.
Just me, huh?
Yeah, that's an older one, isn't it?
No, this is the sequel. It just came out on Steam recently. It's apparently pretty similar from what I've read. There's a few quality of life improvements and some other new stuff. But it's right up your alley. It's basically a RTS come 4X builder.
Huh. Sins of a Solar Empire 2. I like that idea. I like both of those things, so... Cool, thank you for the recommendation. They have pretty elf-looking aliens. Okay, I'm in.
There you go.
Pretty easy to figure out.
Like I said, right up your alley.
Yeah. I played some Street Fighter earlier.
Oh, really?
That was fun. Yeah, Street Fighter 6 is relatively new. I'm not really good at fighting games per se, but it's a fun thing to mix in some variety. And it is exciting to learn stuff and just kind of see yourself progress from being completely incompetent and losing to everyone to being able to win sometimes. That's really fun. So I did some of that. And then I have a bunch of different mindset classes and things like that that we're doing through the subathon. A bunch of different characters that I'll be able to transform into with costumes and makeup and so on. So I'm looking forward to it. This could go for all of June potentially. The longest subathon that we did was 21 days. And then the last one that we did was 13, I think. So we'll see how it goes, but grateful to everyone who supported it so far.
Well, best of luck.
Yeah. So let's get rid of the elephant issue just straight away because I know that people are going to ask about it. There was a court case where Trump was finally got on some stuff, and people were asking the questions about what does that mean for the election.
Pretty much nothing. It's not a sexy answer, but that's the reality of the situation. Most of his core supporters are not going to be swayed by the verdict, and most of his core opponents are obviously not going to be swayed by the verdict. So people in the middle might be affected, and certainly the election is largely going to be fought and won over people in the middle. But I haven't really yet seen convincing evidence that it's going to change a lot of minds there. I think in the short term it'll change some minds. There's definitely some people who have given some indication that they're a little wary about voting for somebody with a record, a criminal who has been convicted. But I suspect that between now and November that a lot of that is just going to kind of fade away. A lot of that sentiment will fade away. So I don't think whatever decides the election for the center of American politics is going to be related to these kinds of court cases. I think it'll be something else, probably. It may be something substantive, it may not be. When an election is close, it can be decided by, just really dumb, trivial shit. It can be something as simple as the weather. If it's like a local election or something, that can affect turnout. And given how low turnout is in a lot of midterm elections and other, sort of off-season type elections, weather can be a factor. If it's close, if the election is close anyway. But yeah, that's, minutia like that is probably going to be more important. Keep in mind, there's a lot of time to go until November, so there's going to be a lot of stuff that happens. The trials here are just going to be one of many things that are going to be in play. And I suspect the most dramatic stuff will just happen to emerge conveniently in October. That's what they call in American politics the October surprise. That's generally when the respective parties kind of bring out the most damning claims and evidence about their opponents.
So you get some really nasty dirt, and you just save it. You save it for then, and that's when you unleash it.
Yeah, because a lot of people don't really pay that much attention to politics. A lot of people find it boring or just stressful or exasperating, and so they kind of tune it out until just before the election. And if they're planning to vote, then they'll try to kind of get an idea of who's running and what their positions are. So that's kind of the better time to really bring out the big guns, if you have any, to try to really spend money to sway people's opinions. So we'll see. I don't doubt that the Democratic Party is going to use this in their advertising, even in October and November. I'm sure they'll still be going out of their way to remind people that this is the first ever president, serving or former, who has been convicted of a felony. They're not going to let you forget that. But again, there's not a lot of people that are still on the fence at this point. And of those who are, probably some are dubious about the trial anyway, because the idea that it's politically motivated does have a fair amount of currency with a lot of people. And among those who don't think that, there's probably going to be a lot of other countervailing evidence that the Republicans will bring out that will weigh on their minds too. And keep in mind, and this is going to be, old news if you're American, but for those of you not from the United States listening, the election is largely over the economy, especially inflation. That's really what kind of bears on most people's day-to-day life. And so that's more what people are concerned about, especially just like regular people who are maybe not following politics all that closely. Like for them, that's their number one issue, generally, in the polls that have been done on that. So stuff like whether or not Trump is a threat to democracy, or how old Joe Biden is, that's all there. That's all relevant. But most people are pretty meat and potatoes when it comes to the issues they really care about. Obviously there's politically involved people who pay a lot of attention. Sometimes those people are one issue voters. Sometimes they have like a broader conception of politics, but most people are not like that. Most of them are just kind of aware that politics is a thing and that they should invest time to understand it so that they can understand how to best vote their interests. But the amount of time that they actually have to spare for that is pretty limited because, people work. They've got 9-to-5 jobs. They've got responsibilities. They have a life. And that's just inherently puts a cap on how much they can do to really stay informed and try to parse the absolute mountain of bullshit that is in the information space. That more than anything is a principal barrier to people fully participating in their nation's politics. So we'll see. We'll see what ends up happening in October. I suspect that'll be the most important. I suspect that's when the most decisive factors will come into play, more so than anything happening, right now.
Yeah, because the ruling doesn't actually change any technical reason why he couldn't be president.
Correct. They could throw him in prison right now and he could still run and still be elected. That's not a big deal. But as is, he's not going to prison. He's going to appeal, and the appeal is going to take the case, well past the election. So that's not going to be a factor, And there's a decent chance that his appeal could go through. He's almost certainly guilty of misappropriating campaign funds. That much I think has been pretty well proven from what I've read about it. The bigger issue is one of the novel theories that they've tried to use in the case. And I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to describe this in the most accurate way. So just keep that in mind. But my understanding is that normally you don't get jail time for like this kind of white collar crime, especially if you're first time. What do you call it? If you're breaking a particular law for the first time, they'll generally go relatively easy on you.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, they tried to tie it to another case, which has to do with election fraud, basically. The idea being that he was trying to defraud the public and mislead them in order to win an election. And so by tying the case to that, supposedly they can increase the punishment, basically. They can make it worse and maybe give him jail time where normally they would not. And so that's kind of more where the ground is shakier, since that has not been done before. That's sort of a new idea that prosecutors have not really used or practiced in previous cases. So the appeal is probably going to focus mostly on that. And again, from what I've read, there's a decent chance that the ruling could be overturned on that count. But I would point out that regardless of how that shakes out, like he's still going to be guilty of the other thing. That's not going to go away. But, I think it will not shock anybody at this point to know that whether or not Donald Trump tried to pay a porn star not to talk about the time he had sex with her is not going to sway anybody's vote, right? I think that doesn't really surprise anybody at this point.
Yeah, it's on trend for his behavior.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, pretty much a non-factor overall would be my judgment. Yeah, the media really went to town on it. They doubled down. NPR in particular was having a field day. Like, this is history. They actually canceled Marketplace on the day that they did it. Well, not canceled, but normally there's a show called Marketplace that airs at 6:30 on NPR. It's actually one of the better business news programs for those vanishing few of you who are interested in that kind of news. But because of the court ruling, of course, they did just wall-to-wall news coverage, and so they ended up scrapping the broadcast of Marketplace for the day. And I was disappointed because I knew that the coverage was going to be dumb, and it mostly was. They can make it as big a deal as they want about the fact that he's the first president to be convicted, but it doesn't really, and maybe I'm just speaking for myself on this, it doesn't really feel like that historical a moment, like the media, some of the media anyway, tries to make it out to be. At this point, it just kind of feels de rigueur for this particular era of American history. I would have rather listened to Marketplace, I guess, is my takeaway.
Yeah, it didn't seem that substantive to you.
Yeah.
I think, figuring out what moderates think of the whole thing, because obviously anyone who is a fan of him is like, they're seeing him getting attacked and that makes them want to defend him as a reaction to it. And then anyone who disliked him, they were already just waiting for something, so maybe they're clapping their hands or something, but yeah, not a super major change. This all makes me feel like moderates are very powerful. Are moderates more powerful than conservatives and progressives because they shift their decisions?
So the way to think about moderates at this point in American history and in American politics is as kingmakers. they're not a major faction unto themselves. In general, the trend over the past couple decades has been for people to increasingly shift towards the fringes of the political spectrum. So there's probably more people closer to the far left or to the far right at this point than there are people to the middle. However, there's not enough people on either far left or far right to win an election by themselves. They can't do that. So they have to get more voters than just what's on the left or right side of the spectrum. And so the only place they can go then is towards the middle. So whoever can win the most votes in the middle is going to win the majority they need to win an election. And so that gives moderates disproportionate power because, while, again, there's not that many of them, you also can't win without them. And so that means that they can send their vote to whoever is the most willing to give the moderates what they want. And of course, being a very competitive political culture, as American politics and political culture is, that means that generally moderates get a lot of what they want. Because invariably, when one side gives one concession to them, then the other one feels compelled to outbid them by offering more. And then that just continues in a tit for tat until everybody on the fringes is very angry because they feel like their party is selling them out to the moderates. They feel sometimes like they might as well be voting for the other party. But the reality is that you have to do this. You can't win without doing this. The only alternative would be to create some kind of far left, far right coalition that excludes the moderates. But obviously, that's not going to happen. I think it could happen in like 10, 20 years. I think we talked before about how there's a possibility of a conservative, populist, progressive coalition in the future, kind of like the New Deal coalition back in the day. But we're a ways off from that for now. So, for now, if you want to win, you have to appeal to moderates. And anybody who doesn't do that, or who loses votes by doing it, there's a lot of people on the left and right who don't like that their parties try to reach out to the middle and then feel discouraged, and so then don't show up to vote. So it's kind of a two-track race in that sense. It's not just who can win the most votes with among the moderate voters. It's also who can do that while at the same time minimizing discouraged voters among their core voting base on the far left or far right. Yeah, I think for the Republican Party, they've been very good at minimizing discouraged voters. But then the flip side of that is that they haven't been as good at reaching out to moderate voters, which again is what they need to win. But then the Democrats are the opposite, right? They've been doing a lot more to reach out to moderate voters, but by extension, they've been having more of a problem with discouraged voters on the far left, especially with the Israel-Gaza conflict going on right now. So, if enough Democrats don't show up to vote because they feel like they're practically voting for Republicans anyway, the Democrats could lose even though they've done a better job of reaching out to moderates. And then, on the flip side, then the Republicans could actually win even though they haven't really reached out as much to moderates just by dint of having more of their side show up to vote. So, it's very difficult to tell just with polling, like what the status is of moderates and then discouraged voters on one side or the other. So it's a little unclear right now just who has the advantage. If you look at, what do you call them, battleground states, right, the purple states, Trump is leading the polls in almost all of them. But at the same time, in the critical ones that Biden, needs to win, if he could win just themselves, there's like 3 states Biden could win that would basically just give him the election. And I think they're all Midwestern states. And even though Trump is leading there, he's not leading by a whole lot. It's pretty much either close to or within the margin of error. And so I think given that fact, it's way too early to call the election in any case, but even if it weren't, it would still be impossible to call just because of the margin of error being, just because the polling is within margin of error. And I suspect that's not going to change too much between now and November. I suspect right up until Election Day, we're not going to really know who's ahead. So it'll be another nail biter probably, which is going to suck. Everybody is going to be very anxious. I'm not looking forward to a repeat of the 2020 election where everybody was glued to the news for an entire week, wondering how the counting was going to go. But that's probably what's going to happen. So buckle up.
Wow. So, how would you recommend people find time to watch Twitch and other TV shows when the news is this silly?
How do you find the time? I mean, that really just varies from person to person, right? Some people just don't have hardly any downtime. My ex-girlfriend is like that. She's got kind of a high-powered corporate type job, so she just doesn't have time to do hardly anything other than work and sleep. For somebody like that, maybe what little time you have for something like exercise or something, maybe while you're exercising, you can watch some news or listen to a podcast or, just try to learn what's going on that way. Just kind of multitask like you would normally do at work. But for other people who have more time, you can just kind of squeeze it in, during recreational time or, just other forms of downtime. Or maybe you have a low intensity job of some kind where you kind of have downtime at work. And so, in that case, maybe you could listen to some kind of politically relevant podcast or something and try to learn that way. So there's different little nooks and crevices in life that you can squeeze in learning, through which you can squeeze learning. And so, that's probably the best way to try to, keep track of things. And, I would point out that the news cycle is 24/7, so I don't expect anybody, even those with a lot of time, to be able to keep track of everything. That's not very realistic.
Mm-hmm.
So you're invariably going to have to economize somehow. And so there's going to be stuff you miss. And so in that sense, it's probably better to just try to focus on stuff that's the most important to you, stuff that's the most important and relevant to your own livelihood, and then maybe whatever other issue is just near and dear to your heart. For some people, it's abortion, either for or against, or or other issues, of that variety. If that's really important, then sure, obviously you would follow that closely. But yeah, at the very least, definitely try to keep track of stuff that's relevant to like your livelihood, how you make your money. Because if nothing else, moves you, that should.
Mm-hmm.
Bad government can wreck that for you pretty thoroughly. So, everybody should try to pay a little bit at least attention to that side of politics. And again, you don't have to do it every day. Maybe just once a week, maybe just find a source you like that you trust and just try to do the bare minimum and keep track of that particular issue, the regulation of your industry or some other issue relevant to your industry. You can follow that. There's not really like a one size fits all solution for that kind of problem. So and even for those who do kind of find a groove, find a way to do this, your mileage is going to vary because you may pick a source that you think is objective and unbiased, but then it turns out not to be, or maybe you pick one that's very biased and is basically that turns out to be captured by special interests. So there's not really any particular way that's going to be completely immune to some variety of bias and or corruption. So just stay on your toes, I guess. Try to shake things up. Try to get opinions from sources that you don't necessarily agree with. Just try to treat it like discourse. Just try to go out and find information and process it as best you can. Rather than trying to just find information that proves that you're right or that disparages whomever you're disagreeing with.
And you would say that even if confirmation bias makes me feel really good throughout my whole body?
Yes, I'm afraid so.
Damn.
I'm afraid you'll just have to suppress it.
Okay. Hearing that you're right does feel pretty good, though.
Yeah. Yeah, it's much less work. If you're already right, then you don't have to read anything.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, I was reading some last night. One of the themes for this subathon is every night before I go to bed, we have a little reading time, and I read Carl Sagan's Cosmos, the first chapter, and he's talking about the first person who figured out that the Earth was not flat and how difficult it was to get that idea across at the time, and how people who were considered the smartest of the time, everyone but him, believed the Earth to be flat. So there is that sort of mental readiness that we should have, where there are some things that society is currently getting wrong right now as a whole, and we haven't really realized it yet. But someone is going to notice it and then gradually argue for it to the point that, okay, we accept it as the most robust and correct way of explaining something. But yeah, we're ignorant of most things. So be prepared. You do hold currently some wrong ideas. Everyone does. It's really hard to root out every single one and be correct on everything. Maybe impossible.
Yeah, it's hard to parse information. It's always been hard to parse information, but maybe never more so than the present, where we have so much information.
Mm-hmm.
It only ever gets harder. Artificial intelligence isn't going to help with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a dynamic game. You have to constantly adapt. But I mean, if you're already working for a living, you already kind of know that, right? Making a living in the modern economy requires constant adaptation, to new regulations, new technologies, new ways of doing things. It's not like it used to be, where you could just kind of sign up, do the same job for 40 years, get a watch, and then retire. That kind of job isn't really around anymore.
Mm.
So that's kind of how you have to approach information. You just kind of got to constantly be skeptical, critical, and aware of your informational surroundings.
Well, Fuzzy Cord's on. I think he has some questions moved along already. We have pretty high viewership tonight, thanks to all the raids, so welcome everyone. We do this segment pretty much every Sunday at around 6 p.m. Pacific, though we do take some weeks off. And then also, if we're talking about a country that you're from and you want to weigh in, we welcome that dialogue. And if we mess anything up, please let us know.
Have you ever gotten a buzz cut, Neuro?
I have not.
I did yesterday.
Really?
Actually, 2 days ago. Yeah, it's the first time.
Huh. What motivated you to do that?
Sorry, what?
What motivated you to do that?
Oh, I had to go to a memorial yesterday.
Oh.
So I had to kind of, get cleaned up. I just couldn't show up with my unkempt long hair.
Mm-hmm.
It had been 3 years since I'd gotten a haircut, so it was a little bit wild.
Yeah, so you just went all the way.
So I had to tame it, and it was actually an accident. I actually asked her to just cut it down to 1 inch short, and then she was like, "Oh, okay, so you just want it all off." And I mistakenly thought she just meant like 1 inch short all around. So I said, "Yeah," and then she said, "Okay," and then she just gave me a buzz cut.
Oh.
All right, that works. I'm not picky. I ain't winning any beauty pageants either which way, so whatever.
Well, you could win a buzz cut beauty pageant now.
I don't think so. I think I'm a little too chubby for that.
Yeah, don't count yourself out. If you win the beauty contest, then I'll tell you. Told you.
Thank you.
Told you. Apparently all the questions so far today are D's nuts jokes.
Well, other than Donald Trump being convicted, was there anything else you wanted to get to?
I don't know if anything else super stood out to me. Here in Hollywood, it's been super busy this week with lots of protests. They're protesting about Palestine and stuff still, yeah. We even saw some There was a vehicle trying to run down protesters, and the protesters are running at the vehicle. It was really interesting times.
Yeah, that does sound very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's one way to get your cardio. Dodge the car.
Yeah. Not really the recommended workout, though.
No.
It's different hazards associated with it.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything new going on with Israel lately. I think there was a new potential ceasefire deal that they were kind of bandying around. Joe Biden went on TV to talk about it, but I don't think it's very likely to be accepted. I'm pretty dubious at this point. But then again, I'm cynical, so, well, I know. But I don't think the Israelis are going to take it. In fact, there were a couple far-right parties that are in Netanyahu's coalition whose leaders came out and said that if Netanyahu accepts this deal, then we're going to leave the coalition and we'll break the government. So Netanyahu is having to perform quite the high wire act right now. He's sort of besieged on all sides by both people in his coalition and those without, and by the United States government, and by just about the rest of the world, too. So I don't quite know how many options he has left at this point, but if nothing else, he can just keep doing what he's been doing. That's kind of always worked for him before. So maybe it'll work for him again. I mean, it's not like anybody wants to intervene directly in Israel at this point. And that's probably what it would take to just stop, the IDF's combat operations in Gaza right now. So they've definitely got the leverage in that regard. But like I've said before, I really just don't know what the plan is. Like, just fighting Hamas until they go away isn't very realistic. I think we had one guy in chat a couple months ago who said that it wasn't, the objective was not to destroy Hamas, but rather just to degrade their capabilities. And that makes sense. I could see that. But then that also raises questions like, how much do you degrade their capabilities? And how do you determine what the degree of degradation is? Is that even really possible? I don't really buy this argumentation that the October attack last year was like this big sophisticated operation that required a lot of planning and training and money. Just looking at it, it seemed like a pretty cheap sheet operation. They just kind of threw guys at the border along with some drones and rockets and shit. Obviously that requires some effort, but it's not, it's not D-Day, right? You don't have to plan too much just to attack a position. So, the degree of degradation that would have to happen to really prevent Hamas from doing something like that again would have to be very high. And I don't think that's really achievable. Again, they just don't need that many people to just storm a wall, especially one that wasn't really being actively defended, which is probably the bigger problem. If the IDF had been properly manning the wall like they were supposed to have been doing, Hamas probably would not have been able to break out in the way they did. But as was, they kind of had a skeleton crew. And so that made it feasible to a degree that it would not have been otherwise. So Netanyahu continues to pretend that he has a plan when he doesn't. The opposition continues to pretend that they're a viable alternative, even though they pretty much want to do the same thing. The opposition's principal objective is to get rid of Netanyahu. But policy-wise, especially vis-a-vis the Palestinians, they don't actually have a different plan, really. It's possible that Gantz may have worked something out with Washington, because they've been kind of playing footsie for the past couple months. Gantz actually traveled to Washington and talked to some officials in the administration. I don't think we know what they were talking about, but given how Netanyahu is kind of on the Biden administration shit list at this point, probably they were talking about the degree to which the United States would support Gantz if he did break with Netanyahu and the emergency government that he's in right now. and tried to push for new elections. I don't doubt that the Biden admin was encouraging him to do something like that. So that could be in the cards, but it's just hard to judge. The longer the war goes on, I think the more exasperated people in Israel get. Not because they want the war to end per se, but because they think Netanyahu is going out of his way to drag it out. The opinion in Israel is that they could have won the war by now if Netanyahu weren't being self-interested. And I actually don't agree with that, even though I'm pretty skeptical of the war. Even though I'm skeptical of Netanyahu, rather, I don't think that it would really play out much different if there was different leadership. So it's kind of a mess right now. I think regardless of what happens, combat operations will continue in Gaza for probably several more months, unless something breaks, like unless somebody does something creative or takes a risk or just something unpredictable happens. Unless something like that happens, the war probably just continues for several more months. And then I don't know what then. I don't think anybody knows what happens then. But for the short term, that would be my prognosis.
Mostly status quo.
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately so. Yeah, the IDF has already had to go back into parts of Gaza they had previously cleared, so it seems like there's no particular end in sight as far as the actual combat side of the operation. So, both the politics and the actual fighting are turning into a morass, a quagmire, as we used to call it in the United States. So good luck to the people of the region untying that Gordian knot.
Yeah.
It's not looking good, but hey, you never know. Maybe somebody will think of something.
How do you de-escalate something like that?
The first thing you need is the will to do so, which is, categorically absent in the case of this conflict. Getting leadership that is willing to recognize reality is the first step. Then you also need leadership that is willing not only to recognize reality, but then is willing to incur the penalty politically for recognizing that reality and taking action corresponding to that reality. So, Netanyahu is a, consummate political operator. Regardless of what's best for Israel, he's always done first what's best for him. So right there, that's a major block. But if you can get to a point where you have leadership that is willing, to take a political hit, that is willing to damage their own popularity, to try to implement a solution that could actually resolve a problem or conflict, then you're at least on the right track. It's not inevitable that it'll work out. For a lot of policy problems, solutions are often probabilistic, meaning that there may be a particular solution that is most likely to work, but there's very rarely any solution to a problem that is guaranteed to work. And as a result, a lot of politicians see optimal solutions rather as being suboptimal, because from their perspective, it comes with risk that is too high from their perspective, because obviously they don't want to take risks. Generally there's a set of options to any problem that are risky but optimal as far as actually solving the problem, and then there's another set of options that are much less risky from a political perspective, but also have virtually no chance of actually solving anything. And generally politicians like the latter set of solutions much more than the former set of solutions. So that's where leadership really comes into the picture. You have to have people that are willing to look at the former set of solutions and say, that's the best way to go, even if it's not necessarily best for me. But even in liberal democracies where, people are kind of conditioned that politicians are supposed to be public servants, and where there are a lot of checks and balances and whatnot, even in liberal democracies, it can be very, very hard to find politicians like that. Probably helps if all your politicians aren't lawyers. I don't know how many people, even in the United States, are aware of this, but like a huge disproportionate share of politicians serving in office in the United States are lawyers.
Huh, I didn't know that specifically, but it makes sense if you're acquainted with the laws. Being involved in writing them and editing them and so on makes sense.
And running for office, since there's, a whole litany of rules and regulations there.
Mm-hmm.
If you're already familiar with the law, then it's much easier to learn those. Whereas if you're not, then it can be a little daunting. Also, the ubiquity of lawyers in American politics really explains American political culture, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Contentious, overemphasis on debate over conversation, emphasis on rhetoric over substance. That's all lawyer territory. So it kind of makes sense then that that is how American political culture is colored, so to speak. People kind of take their professional culture with them into other avenues of life that they go down. And so as a result, American politics is disproportionately defined by American legal culture, as opposed to other types of culture in the United States. It would be different if they were all doctors, Neuro. I don't know that there's a legal equivalent to the Hippocratic Oath. Maybe there should be.
If we had doctors in office, at least then our nation could heal.
There you go. Well, what else? I've got stuff, but I wanted to ask you.
I wasn't able to browse much news this week, so yeah, aside from the super obvious.
Oh, yeah. People were all excited about it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we did have some questions, so we could get to that. I've got some weird stuff. Something was in the water the past week, because there was a bunch of dumb shit that happened, too. But we'll save that for later. Let's see. Do you have thoughts on the upcoming election in Mexico and what impact new border policy will have on the U.S. election? Thoughts on the upcoming election? I think the fact that it's, most likely it's going to be Obrador's successor who wins. So, the election isn't really going to change much if that's the case. Probably the new administration, more specifically, the new administration's policies will probably be defined much more by continuity with their predecessor than distinctions. So probably not much will change, assuming, that the successor wins. I thought it was interesting that it'll be the first time that Mexico has had a female president if Obrador's successor wins, so that'll be new. I was listening to a thing on NPR the other day about how a lot of women in Mexico are kind of excited about that because, there's a lot of machismo in Mexican culture. And so women kind of appreciate having one of their own in power, or, again, will if she wins. I also thought it was pretty interesting that she was actually Jewish. It's not, I don't really think of Mexico as a place that has a lot of Jews, but obviously they have some. I'm sure the far right will have a field day with it. They always do. But beyond that, I don't think much will change. The country will stay on its current track. That's not necessarily the best track. Obrador's done some things that have been really popular, like increasing the minimum wage and populist type stuff like that. But he's also gone out of his way to centralize power into the the federal government, away from the states. And that's reduced the discretion of, local authorities of one kind or another, which is not generally a great sign, pretty much regardless of context. he hasn't really been able to deal with the crime problem or the cartels very well. The Hugs Not Bullets program was not a success, unsurprisingly. But I haven't really seen much of a follow up. I think one of the other problems was that he's increased the profile of the military, not only in day to day life, but just in Mexican political institutions. If I remember correctly, he's appointed a number of military officers to lead certain agencies, generally security related, but some not. And so that had some people worried about militarization of Mexican politics. I suspect he's not doing it to get, because he trusts the Mexican military a whole lot. I think he's doing it more for patronage. He's cultivating allies in the Mexican military, and that's going to be a problem later on because eventually, there's going to be some kind of break, maybe a change in government or somebody who wants to reduce the profile of the military. And if the military doesn't like that, they may have accumulated so much power that they just decide to stop them, whereupon you'll have something akin to a constitutional crisis. But, that's in the future, and that's speculation on my part. It could be that Obrador just has it under control. We'll see.
Is that similar to what happened in Egypt?
No, not in Egypt, because in Egypt's case, the military just outright launched a coup in the 1950s and seized control. Mm-hmm. In this case, it's more of a sort of mission creep, right? The military isn't really supposed to have a wide profile outside of the security sphere, but there are certain areas where there are allies of Obrador in the military that he trusts to do that. And because the public trusts the military more than it trusts, politicians, Obrador has found it efficacious to allow those allies in the military to run those agencies. So, it's a civil military project, right? It's not just the military pushing Obrador to give him power. Certainly not the military seizing power. In Egypt's case, the military seized power, and that was it. There's been no real civilian authority in Egypt ever since. There have been times where they pretended there was a civilian authority, but it was always clear, even after the Arab Spring, where the real power was. And I think Morsi didn't last more than like a year or two before that power was exercised to get rid of him. The only other pole of power within Egyptian politics is the judiciary, which has some degree of autonomy. But it's become less. It's shrunk over time because what the military does is it actually funnels its officers into the judiciary. People will become officers in the military, and then they'll be sent to law school or whatever, and then they'll be given positions in the judiciary. So at this point, it's a quasi-independent institution. That is to say, the judiciary is a quasi-independent institution. But it's not fully independent. There's a lot of influence that the military has over it to the point where it's de facto controlled by the military. So different cases for now. If the Mexican military stages a coup, then we'll talk again. Then it will be much more comparable. But for now, not comparable. Trying to think of some other stuff that Obrador did, but it's not coming to mind. He's been busy. I think he renationalized the oil industry, didn't he? I think I remember reading about that. So that's well within the Mexican government's right to do that. But the reason that they had partially privatized it in the first place is because there was too much corruption. Too much of the money that was supposed to go to maintenance and investing in new production was being siphoned off for political projects. And so even though Mexico has huge oil reserves, they weren't actually making much money off of it. And the amount of money they were getting was actually shrinking. So nationalizing it again will get them more money since they don't have to pay royalties to foreign oil firms, but it also puts them back to square one, right, with the original problem of corruption. And, given Obrador's style of governance, I'm a little dubious that he's not going to steal a whole bunch. But we'll see. I think for now it's early days yet, so there hasn't been a whole lot of evidence of deterioration in the oil industry yet, as far as I know. Let's see, what was the other part of the question? And what impact new border policy will have on the U.S. election? New American, well, okay. So new Mexican border policy. I don't think Mexico's border policy is going to change. Like I said, the new administration will probably see the same party win, and so there's going to be a lot of continuity there.
What's their current policy?
It's defined more by cooperation, I would argue, which I know a lot of people are not going to like hearing. There's an impression in the United States that Mexico just goes out of its way to facilitate migrants moving through Mexico to get to the U.S. border, but that's not really accurate. Mexico actually is pretty anti-immigrant. Because keep in mind, it's not like the people moving through Mexico from Central America are all going to the United States. There's also a decent chunk that are just staying in Mexico, trying to find work there. And it's, as I understand it, it's pretty much a consensus position in Mexican politics that they don't want those people there. And there's actually not inconsiderable prejudice against people from Central America in Mexico on top of that. So, they've actually got pretty tough immigration laws in Mexico itself, somewhat ironically. And I would point out, too, that immigration from Mexico into the United States by actual Mexican nationals has tailed off considerably from a couple decades ago. There's definitely Mexicans still coming over, but Mexico itself actually offers a lot more opportunities than it used to. Anybody who's been paying attention to the whole reshoring thing, is probably aware of that. There's a whole lot of new factories opening up in northern Mexico, hiring a lot of people. So, if you're Mexican, you have good reason to stay in Mexico. There's lots of decent jobs there. Mexico City has really taken off. It's still a developing country, but it's more developed than I think, especially Americans, give it credit for. There's a lot of, for example, there's a lot of corporations that actually have research and development operations in Mexico now to take advantage of skilled labor there, college graduates, technical expertise, engineers, what have you. So it's better off now than people give it credit for, and that's reduced the amount of immigration from Mexican nationals moving into the United States. So, the Mexican government doesn't have big incentive politically to be lax on immigration like they used to be. Because when it was mostly Mexican nationals, obviously voters were sympathetic to them and wanted the Mexican government to help them. And so there was kind of a limit to the degree to which the Mexican government could cooperate with the United States on immigration problems. Because trying to inhibit immigration of Mexican nationals into the United States would have been very politically unpopular. But since that's tailed off, now it's not politically unpopular, or at least not as politically unpopular. And so the Mexican government, especially under Obrador, given that he has stronger populist left-wing credentials, has had a freer hand to deal with the immigration issue than previous governments have. And so the result has been that, yes, there actually has been more cooperation on that front. That's not to say that the Mexican government has liked the way that the U.S. government has handled the issue, just that they've been more willing to cooperate. The idea of Mexico being a staging ground for people seeking asylum in the United States while their application goes through. Mexico City doesn't really like that because it results in these huge sort of refugee tent cities popping up on their side of the border, which they find very expensive to deal with. They have to provide those people food, protection, what have you, and that's very draining of resources, especially at a local and state level. So they would rather some other place be the staging ground, the holding ground, if you will, for these refugees, asylum seekers, economic migrants, whatever you prefer to call them. But as is, they don't really have quite the leverage to make that happen, so they've had to make the best of it. So I don't think anything is going to change. That's the short version of my answer to the question. It's mostly just going to be status quo. And I would point out that even if Trump wins the election, that will probably continue to be the case. Because Trump was in office for 4 years, and a good chunk of that overlapped with Obrador and his presidency in Mexico. And Obrador and Trump were actually pretty willing to cooperate with each other, despite being sort of ideologically speaking antagonistic to each other. Obrador was more of a left populist, Trump obviously more of a right populist. So I had expected when Trump won office that there would be fireworks there, and I especially expected them after Obrador was elected. I kind of thought there was a ticking time bomb there embedded in the relationship, but it turned out that it was not so much the left or right part of their political identities that were as important as the populist part. And it was the populist tendency towards transactional politics that carried the day there. Both Washington and Mexico City were willing to kind of make a number of trade-offs and transactions to stabilize the relationship.
They like making a good deal.
Yeah. So that's pretty much what it came down to. Neither government really complained as much about immigration as a result. But again, that largely just came down to Trump and Obrador kind of working together, right? They had an understanding. It was not an understanding that actually did much to solve the problem, but it did result in cooperation on a range of superficial measures that allowed the respective governments to pretend to be solving the problem. And that obviously is a very popular proposition. Because keep in mind, business interests in both Mexico and the United States very much enjoy free flow of labor. That's cheap labor for them.
Mm.
And so taking superficial action to deal with illegal immigration is very attractive, especially for business interests in the United States, because that means pressure to deal with the immigration issue is deflected while at the same time effectively allowing for the continued flow of illegal, cheap, undocumented labor into the United States and into the factories of business interests. So I imagine that if Trump is reelected, regardless of his bold claims that he's going to stage a massive deportation campaign, I suspect it'll play out pretty much exactly the same as it did during his first term. And I don't think that's going to involve like deportation campaigns or any dramatic bullshit like that. It's possible, if he does win again, his administration will be much more coherent, since he's basically purged out all of the people that really disagreed with him, and will probably have mostly a loyalist cabinet going into his second term. So he'll definitely be trying to do more bold things, and he'll be more successful, relatively speaking, in a prospective second term than in his first term. But at the same time, given how transactional he is, I doubt that he'll go as far as he's saying he'll go right now, because I suspect that he's for sale, and really nobody outbids American corporations in the grand scheme of things. Corporate America has an unbeaten record. So, if I have to bet against them or bet against Trump, I'm betting against Trump. I suspect they'll buy him off with something that he wants.
When you put it that way, it makes him seem more like a predictable politician than an unpredictable one. Because maybe you can't predict what his stance is on any given policy because he doesn't really have one. But you can predict that he does want to accept good deals that come his way.
Mm-hmm.
So you can kind of look at the actors around him who feel like they could leverage him in some way. And if they make him feel powerful, give him benefits, give him money, then he's likely to do what he can to do them favors. It's, like you said, transactional politician.
Yeah. Yeah, that was what we learned from the first term, right? Going into the first term, everybody was scared. Nobody knew what to expect. Like, what's this guy going to actually do with all this power? And then the answer was not really that much, right? In the grand scheme of things. Obviously, part of that, again, was because of internal opposition within his own administration. But, it was also just because he talked to other elites, be they corporate elites in the United States or leaders of other countries. And when they were willing to play ball, he was generally happy to agree to some kind of superficial bullshit agreement of some kind that allowed everybody to pretend like they were doing something when they, weren't.
Mm.
And, when he negotiated with people like that, he found pretty willing partners. So, I think the expectation for the second term, if he gets one, is not, is he going to do something crazy? I think given the track record in the first term, I would expect that less now going into the second term than the first. and especially given how transactional he proved in the first term.
Mm-hmm.
Again, though, to reiterate the earlier point, the wild card is going to be his advisors, because he's going to have a very different set of much more loyalist, obedient advisors than he had in the first term. So that could open things up to more crazy bullshit than occurred in the first term. That's possible. I can't rule that out. But at the same time, given the track record in the first term, I have to imagine that lobbyists and established interests, which I remind you were just as anxiety-ridden as everybody else going into the first term. They really didn't know how to deal with this, new factor in American politics. But, after 8 years, I think they kind of have his number. So I suspect going into a prospective second term, they're going to be a lot more aggressive in lobbying a second-term Trump administration. And probably especially with trying to talk directly with Trump, because his advisors have proven to be a snake's nest, even in the first term. So I think any lobbyist is going to really try to avoid them as much as possible and speak directly to the president and try to get him to agree to some kind of transactional arrangement that will protect their interests and allow him to pretend to be some kind of super successful go-getter president. It's going to be a Goya brand second term, Neuro.
Goya brand, yeah.
Do you remember that?
I don't remember that. I know the company. I have some of their black beans and corn I'll get. That's the
basically
canned food company?
Yeah, it's a private company, and the CEO came out and publicly announced that he fully supported and backed Trump, and that he was going to, donate, a lot of money to him. And Trump responded by having a photo shoot, a PR op, whatever you want to call it, where he had a bunch of Goya brand cans stacked up on a desk. And he posted a picture of them on Twitter and then gave them his official seal of approval.
Wow.
Yeah. It was very crass. It was very obvious what was going on there. That was a very clear transactional arrangement between the two. But I think a prospective second term will be more of that, rather than James Bannon crazy shit.
Mm-hmm.
Or was his name Steve Bannon? I'm always forgetting the first name. Sorry, I interrupted. You were saying?
No, you're good.
Oh. But yeah, that's Mexico. Are there any countries where the Belt and Road Initiative has shown a net positive economic impact outside of China? I mean, pretty much all of them, right? It's not the debt trap that people make it out to be. Well, that Washington in particular tries to make it out to be. There's definitely been countries that borrowed too much money and then ended up defaulting. But in those cases, I would point out that most of that was because the governments themselves just stole the money and didn't want to pay it back. And also that even in those cases, the project did result in infrastructure being built. It may not always have been the most useful infrastructure, but it did add value. It's not a bad thing to have some kind of corrupt arrangement that does result, at the very least, in improvements to public services. Japan, for example, is notorious for their constant infrastructure investments that stem not from a desire to boost the economy or make the economy more efficient. It's purely transactional. Local politicians trade votes for basically money coming into their district, usually in the form of infrastructure investment, all the time. That's been a cornerstone of Japanese politics for decades, maybe even generations. And so, even if a lot of the resulting spending is wasted, sometimes it's useful. The story I always come back to was the 2011 tsunami that hit Japan. And there was this one particular town that would have been destroyed by the tsunami, save for the fact that they had this huge-assed barrier, basically a seawall that was designed to protect the town from tsunamis. And, the value of the project was totally out of whack with the size of the settlement, right? The cost-benefit for protecting a town of that size with a project that expensive does not check out. But they built it anyway just because of just because of politics, probably assuming that it would never actually be used. But it actually did end up getting used, and it actually did end up saving a lot of property and a lot of lives. So it's not entirely a bad thing to waste money on stuff like that. That's it would be better not to waste money or to steal it or what have you. But if we are going to do the objectively wrong thing, there's productive and unproductive ways to do that.
Yeah, so Agent Smith is basically saying if you're going to be a villain, at least you should accidentally do some good things sometimes.
There you go.
I was trying to be corrupt, but I built a bridge and now people are using it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, there's a lot of stuff like that with the Belt and Road, right? Obviously China is self-interested, obviously corrupt governments that are the beneficiaries and recipients of Belt and Road Project money steal a lot of that money and put their countries into debt that they can't pay back. But at the same time, there is actual investment happening. Roads are built. Cement, so many cement factories. Whenever I look into Belt and Road projects to figure out like what is actually being invested in, what's actually being built, there's always cement factories. I don't know why, but for some reason they really love building cement factories. So cement factories, highways, railroads, dams, you name it. Power plants, just any number of things that are going to be useful down the line are being built. And, again, the cost benefit doesn't always check out. Like in the case of Sri Lanka, they built a huge port facility in the hometown of the then president, Rajapaksa, whom we've talked about before. And it was stupid, right? There's no reason for a large port to be there. There's never going to be enough traffic for the port to like make enough money to kind of pay for itself. It was very obviously a political project so that the president could reward his core supporters in his core district, which of course, again, was the district that he grew up in. But at the same time, a port's a port, right? So, they will be able to use that in future. However the debt situation shakes out, they will continue to be able to use that. And before somebody jumps in to say, well, the Chinese government forced them as a condition of debt forgiveness to give control of that port to the Chinese, that's not true. They gave control of part of the port to Chinese companies. And yes, Chinese companies are definitely under the thumb of the Communist Party of China. But keep in mind, they do have agreements in place that limit what they can do. Like, they can't just turn it into a military port against the will of the government. And if they do it anyway, then the government is totally in its rights to just nationalize the product and take it from them. And if they did that, there would not be a whole lot China could actually do about that. This is a problem that the IMF has had over its history. They lend lots of money to other countries, and then they kind of hope that they actually implement the reforms that they agreed to in order to get the money. But what happens in practice is that a lot of countries will just renege on those promises, and then the IMF doesn't get the money back. So in that situation, there's not much the IMF can do other than to just say that, well, we're not going to give you any more money until you actually pay us back. China is going to be in the same situation, right? They're not going to invade a country because they don't pay back Belt and Road money. And probably they're not going to sanction them either. Hypothetically they could, but that doesn't really help them that much in the grand scheme of things. And I would point out too that Belt and Road spending has been curtailed significantly over the past 8 some years. Specifically, well, maybe not specifically, partly because so many recipient countries are in arrears. In other words, they're just not paying the money back. It was turning into a big money sink for the Chinese government. And so they kind of scaled down the program and have focused more on smaller projects that are more profitable in countries that they have more confidence in, shall we say. So the Belt and Road is kind of overhyped as a tool of Chinese influence. They were doing it in the first place mostly to promote their own industrial policy. They wanted to generate jobs for people. They wanted to generate demand for Chinese products. For example, they got really into railroad construction, partly because they were trying to develop a modern railway and train industry. China is one of the leaders in high-speed rail now because of all those investments. And foreign demand generated from Belt and Road money was a part of that project. So that was much more important. That was a much more important impetus to the Belt and Road than foreign influence. They weren't trying to buy the world or turn countries into dependencies that would be under the thumb of the party. They mostly just wanted to expand their industrial policy. So to answer the question more directly, there were a lot of projects that had a net benefit economic impact. And to reiterate, not all of them had a net positive fiscal impact on finances of the host governments. But in terms of broader economic impact, just very positive in the vast majority of cases. That's one of the reasons developing countries around the world tend to be very favorable towards China with regard to things like trade, with regard to trade specifically, if not also other issues like recognition of Taiwan and extradition agreements with the party, stuff like that. The United States says that being dependent on China is a fool's errand, and that they use all of these technologies that they sell to surveil on people and spy on people, and then of course what the response is, right? Everybody says, well, you do the same thing. Washington also spies on us, so it's kind of a moot point whether or not the stuff we buy from China or the United States, whether the stuff we buy from China is used to spy on us. Like, we're going to get spied on regardless of who we buy from, so let's buy from whoever sells it the cheapest, because at least then we have more money to spend on other things.
We get spied on. News at 8.
Yeah, so most of the developing world doesn't really care that much about Sino-American competition. For them, they just don't want it to interfere with their development, with their trade. That's the number one priority. And so they don't participate in the United States' tariff wars or trade wars with China. They don't put export restrictions on the export of certain goods to China, nor do they put tariffs on Chinese goods. They're pretty open to the influx of Chinese goods and investment, which again has been mostly beneficial for them. And the United States, I would point out, has really not given them any reason not to do those things. Because even if the United States is an important part of the global economy, most countries would prefer trade with China at this point, just because they trade relatively more with China, and because China buys more stuff like core commodities, which are generally more important parts of these economies. The United States also buys stuff, but generally its economic influence is felt more in things like investment, which can be an important factor in building a modern economy that is not dependent on the export of commodities. But a lot of countries just don't have the chops. Well, they don't have the governments, let's say, to make that kind of move. So for them, not having access to Western finance is not a big deal, because they weren't getting any in the first place. So, no Western finance, limited Western consumption of your exports, as compared to large amounts of Chinese government investing in from the Belt and Road Project, and a huge amount of commercial consumption in China of your commodity exports. If you have to choose between them, generally these countries are going with China. And again, that doesn't mean they're aligning with China. They're not strategic allies. They're just leaning towards China in terms of trade policy, which does give Beijing some influence, but given that there's a ready alternative in the form of the West, there's a limit to how much they can actually leverage that influence leverage that influence to force other developing country governments to do what they want. So, the whole idea that China is bullying the rest of the world with trade, it's a little bit oversold. They've done it in very particular cases, like Australia, for example, had experiences with that. They do it with Taiwan pretty frequently. But as far as the developing world goes, most of them just don't care enough about China to do anything that would antagonize Beijing in the first place.
Maybe a little bit of hyperventilating from people.
Yeah. Yeah, the United States really needs a better strategy to deal with that. Because right now, American strategy as far as economic competition with China is largely a combination of tariffs, export restrictions, and then lots and lots of hectoring. Washington loves to hector other governments about trading too much with China. They never really follow it up with anything, though. They never give other countries any actual incentives to curtail trade with China. They just sort of tell them that it's a bad idea and that they shouldn't do it, which, of course, doesn't carry much weight. So there's just a clear lack of strategic clarity there for Washington as far as to how to actually deal with that aspect of competition with China.
China's a very interesting country. Lots of stuff going on there.
Let's see. What happened with the Houthi attack on the U.S. carrier Eisenhower? There are a lot of conflicting reports. I hadn't heard about that. I'd heard about the Houthis shooting down some American drones, but given that they're getting support from Iran and given how easy it is to shoot down drones, that didn't really surprise me too much. But I hadn't heard about the carrier. So one of the first returns is an Al Jazeera article that has the word attack in quotation marks, so I'm immediately suspicious. Yeah, I don't know that they can penetrate carrier battle group air defenses, so I'm a little dubious that they would actually be able to hit anything. So the Houthis did announce that they attacked the carrier. And apparently the Houthis have a TV station, a news station, that they announced it on. I'm sure they have lots of colorful programming. Yeah, you're not going to do this, not going to do that. Let's see, CENTCOM said on Twitter... Oh, that was the response, I guess? Yeah, they're not really saying much about a Houthi attack, so... I don't know. I'll read more about it later. I don't want to get us bogged down in it, but I'm pretty dubious they would be able to hit anything if they did attack it. But we'll see. I'll look into it. How old is this report anyway? 31st of May, a couple days ago. Wait, what? Huh. So not all of the answers are going to be entirely satisfactory. I'll throw out the usual disclaimer to underline that. I am not an expert in everything I talk about on here. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this. I can't walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. But I will read it later, so I will get the feedback eventually. And I do enjoy the feedback. Often colorful as it is.
Thanks, chat. Appreciate you.
Let's see. Can you provide clarification over the current terms of that ceasefire? How is this ceasefire different from the plan ironed out by Egypt and Qatar? And is Biden accurate in framing it as Israel's plan? Good questions. Let me see if I can remember. So clarification over the current terms of the ceasefire. So it was a 3-point plan. Or maybe I should say 3-block plan. So block 1 was just going to be a 6-week ceasefire. And I think block 2 was going to be the actual exchange of hostages. Well, sorry, that would be, block 2 would be Hamas giving up some hostages. I think it was going to be women, children, and the elderly, and the injured. And then in exchange, Israel would give up some undetermined number of Palestinian prisoners of some variety. Basically the typical kind of deal that Israel has done with groups like Hamas in the past when they managed to capture Israeli citizens of some kind.
A prisoner exchange.
Yeah. So then block 3 would be a much bigger, a much heavier lift, basically. It would involve substantive negotiations to actually bring the conflict to a close. And they were a little fuzzier on the details there, I think. I think they were angling for something like an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, withdrawal of all military forces, and the agreement of reconstruction funds and projects for Gaza, and then also some kind of new arrangement for governance in Gaza. I think that particular issue is the one they were the most ambiguous on. Because, of course, that's the most controversial and thorny issue at this juncture. So, again, just off the top of my head, that's what I'm remembering. I might be getting some of the details wrong, or I might be forgetting some, but I think that was the gist of it. Let's see, so how is that plan different than the one ironed out by Egypt and Qatar? Well, I don't think the plan from Egypt and Qatar had 3 blocks to it. So there's at least that. Beyond that, as far as the actual substantive details, I think the difference is largely in the order of events. I think the Egyptian and Qatari deal had the ceasefire occurring concomitant with the what would you call it? The prisoner exchange, as Neuro put it. The exchanging of some hostages for some prisoners. So there would not be a ceasefire first and then an exchange, as with the recently announced plan. Rather, the previous plan would have had that happening at pretty much the same time. And then there would be ongoing negotiations beyond that for some kind of final resolution. In the case of Biden's plan, if you want to call it that, the events are much more sequential. There would be a ceasefire first, and then a negotiation about an exchange. And then, after that's done, they would actually talk about ending the fighting for good. And I would point out that I don't remember the Egypto-Qatari plan. Is that a word? I don't remember. I don't remember the details of that plan so well. Because whenever these ceasefire plans get announced, my immediate assumption is, oh, that's not going to go anywhere. And because I'm almost always right, I haven't really had much incentive to change my approach there. So I don't follow the details of these plans very closely, because they almost always don't go anywhere. I would point out that this newest plan that is being pushed by Biden will probably end up the same way. But as far as I can remember, that's the main difference. For what that's worth, given how weak my memory is. Is Biden accurate in framing it as Israel's plan? I don't think so. I don't think it's Israel's plan. I think it's probably more of an American plan, although I'm sure the Biden administration would rather not take credit for it. Plans generally have a better chance of success if you get one of the sides that's actually involved in a conflict to kind of take ownership of it, so that they can present it as their plan, rather than presenting it as a foreign plan that is being imposed on them.
That made me think, didn't China make a plan for how to end the war in Ukraine?
They did. It was dumb. It never went anywhere, and it never had any chance of going anywhere.
Hey, but someone made that plan.
Yeah, they did make it, and they did announce it, and then everybody forgot.
They probably had multiple meetings.
I'm sure. Maybe even in nice office chairs. Yeah, I don't doubt it. But you got to do more than just announce a prospective peace deal. You do actually have to talk to the respective sides, get feedback. If they're not willing to agree to anything, then it doesn't really matter what you do. Mm-hmm. You can present all the peace plans you want, but if they want to fight, they're going to fight. That's what it comes down to. So yeah, I don't think it's an Israeli plan. I think it's an American plan that the Biden administration is trying to get both the Israeli government and Hamas to take ownership of. Whether or not they succeed is, again, extremely doubtful. I really don't think it's going to work. Because right now, Netanyahu has every reason to keep the war going. Hamas obviously doesn't really stand to gain that much. Obviously they're losing a lot of people, but that's not a big deal for them. They can recover from that eventually. They're kind of playing for time. They can kind of just tie Israel down into an endless conflict in Gaza. And of course, the more regular people in Gaza who suffer, the better from their perspective. Because then that makes the Israelis in international media look unreasonable. You're fighting this endless war that you're obviously not going to win in any kind of clear-cut or substantive way, and it's coming at the cost not of Hamas, but largely more so at at the cost of, the civilian population. The burden is falling disproportionately on the civilian population rather than Hamas. Let's put it like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so the international media and as well as international, foreign governments abroad, they're increasingly hard pressed to kind of portray the conflict as some kind of even-keeled conflict, as a war, as the Israelis like to say it is. It just looks more and more like, the Israelis are going full Balkans on a tiny territory of people they don't like. And that, of course, is not garnering them a lot of sympathy. So that's going to be Hamas's strategy. Whether or not it works, we'll see. It kind of depends more on, developments within Israeli politics. And like I said, they're kind of stuck right now. And so something's going to have to happen there to break that logjam. I don't know what that'll be. But for now, it's just totally ambiguous. But that's all we had for questions.
Thank you, Fuzzy Cone, for passing those along.
Yeah, thank you. Hopefully some of these answers made sense.
We also like first-hand accounts as well, so if you know anything that's been happening in your area recently, feel free to share your story. We have an American perspective here. We're from the United States, both of us, which means a partial picture of the world.
Oh, yeah.
I'm still chugging along in our 4-player Baldur's Gate run in honor mode. That's been really fun. It goes so fast with 4 people. We're level 7 now, I think.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Any new developments there?
We've taken some different choices. Like there was an evil choice that caused all the deep gnomes to be killed by Nair. And we kind of take turns letting each other take like the main story decisions. So sometimes the more aggressive person is in the driver's seat and people die.
Yeah.
That's how it is.
That's how it goes.
I tend to play pretty nice overall. I like playing a Seldarine drow. They're the nicer kind of drow.
Mm.
Loathsworn drow, they're very elitist. They think they're the best and everyone else is garbage.
Yeah, I've seen some of Minthara's lines.
Mm-hmm.
You get that impression pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Is that what we're going to do? Something like that? Or did you have something else in mind?
Yeah, we could do some honor mode run or something. It's pretty fun. We don't need to get any certain duration. It's kind of just fun to see what happens and what classes people pick and what decisions people make.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I'm glad that you finally got your computer upgrade and you can play Baldur's Gate. And I remember before you got that one.
Yeah, I got it in a condition where it can run it.
Mm-hmm.
Although it can't run it at the highest setting particularly well. Yeah, generally, yeah, it's still fun, and generally I tolerate some of the lags and whatnot. But I think when we do it, I'll probably just put it on the lowest setting, just so we don't drag out the runtime.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have to wait for me and my computer to catch up.
Yeah, fair.
With whatever's happening. Yeah, the lowest setting isn't bad. It doesn't look terrible. It's just not nearly as good as the upper settings, obviously.
Yeah.
Well, we did have some stuff happening in Ukraine.
What's that?
Well, the first thing is a correction, because we were talking about restrictions on Ukraine's ability to use ranged fires on targets in Russia proper. When I say Russia proper, that excludes all of the disputed territory, like Crimea and the Donbass, and I guess at this point, Kherson and Zaporizhia as well. So I had said the last time we did this that I could have sworn that Ukraine had been using some ranged fires in some cases in Russian territory, in territory that is not disputed. And then somebody in chat said that that was wrong. So I looked into it, and I was wrong. They have not done that. So I guess I was misremembering, or maybe I remembered a strike on like Crimea or something and thought, oh, well, that's Russian territory, so that counts. So obviously that's different. So there has not yet, or had not yet been, use of ranged fires on targets in Russia. That is to say, ranged fires involving Western supplied missiles. There have been ranged fires on targets in Russia using homemade missiles. That is to say, stuff like Neptune missiles and drones and whatnot, indigenous to Ukraine and its defense industrial base. But they hadn't been able to use like Storm Shadow missiles or ATACMS or HIMARS or what have you.
Such an awesome name for a missile.
Storm Shadow.
Yes.
Yeah. It's fun. I grant you that. Well, the question last week was well timed. There was already some debate about it because Ukraine had not really had the munitions to launch strikes on the buildup of Russian forces on the other side of the border opposite Kharkiv before the offensive on Kharkiv started a couple weeks ago. And so they complained pretty bitterly about that if there had been no restrictions, they would have been able to soften up those forces and they would not be making quite so many gains sort of on the Kharkiv axis right now on the front. So in the past week, there's been a number of countries that have come out and actually clarified their position and loosened restrictions on how Ukraine can use their munitions. So thus far, as I have in my notes anyway, France, the United States, and the United Kingdom have all loosened restrictions in this regard. And so what they've said is that Ukraine actually can use their missiles to hit targets in Russia proper, but only if it's relatively close to the border, and only if it's to strike targets from where there had been Russian munitions launched against Ukraine. So if Russia launches a bunch of missiles at Ukrainian targets from Russia proper, according to these new rules, Ukraine should be able to strike those targets with Storm Shadow, ATACMS, HIMARS, etc., Western supplied missiles from these three particular countries, the US, the UK, and France. Other countries have not relaxed restrictions, or in the case of Germany, haven't directly provided ranged fires as of yet to Ukraine. But I would point out, too, that last week I said that in general, regardless of whether Ukraine struck targets using Western munitions or not that were in Russia, the general trend had been that over time, the West had relaxed restrictions on Ukraine and allowed them to escalate bit by bit, incrementally, which is not necessarily the best way to do it, but it's not without merit either. And, lo and behold, the past week, they have loosened those restrictions and are going to allow an incremental escalation. So that seems to be the policy for the West. Make of it what you will, but, that's the track we're on.
Look, we're going to sell you these weapons, but don't use them on offense. Over time, okay, we're going to give you these weapons, but don't use them on offense except for in these cases. 2 years later, we're going to sell you these weapons. Have fun.
Yeah, eventually we'll get to a point where we're actually serious about supplying Ukraine and helping them either win the war or at least survive the war. But right now, we're kind of too afraid of Russia, I guess. That's been the criticism I've seen from some analysts. You should worry less about what Russia's going to do and try to focus more on ensuring that Russia is afraid of what you're going to do. But of course, the counter argument is that that's needlessly escalatory and that the stakes are too high to be that laissez-faire, so to speak. Well, not laissez-faire, to be that cavalier about the conflict. So, I'm not your mother. I'm not here to tell people what to believe. Pick your side, whatever you like. But those are sort of the respective arguments. Obviously, they get into more detail than that, but that is an ongoing debate right now between analysts. And the trend is towards, full support of Ukraine eventually, but it's just taking forever to get there. I would point out that there is a buildup of industrial capacity in the West not only the United States, but also Germany, France, etc., that is going to significantly increase the ability of the West to provide things like artillery shells, anti-tank missiles, anti-air missiles, what have you. But it's not going to really hit stride until probably next year. So 2025 is the year in which we should have enough 155 millimeter artillery shell production in the West to be able to provide Ukraine something close to what was it, 2 million shells a year, something like that. Actually, maybe it's more like 1 million. I don't quite remember the exact number. Ukraine says that it needs about 1 million shells a year. And right now, we're not anywhere close to that. But by 2025, we should be. So at that point, Ukraine's army should be much more competitive vis-a-vis the Russian army, at least in that regard. We're also scaling up production of vehicles, small arms, stuff like that. That hasn't been as much of a problem, but that should also help them out. So Russia is also scaling up its industry, but they've also got limitations in terms of things like financing, in terms of manpower. Inflation is taking a toll. The private sector is getting hit. So, there's problems there that are brewing. Everybody says, the Russian economy is doing great. GDP is up, blah, blah, blah. Technically, that's true, but, keep in mind that most of that growth is to do with military spending. And you can only do that so much, right? You can only invest so much money in the guns before the lack of investment in butter starts to really hurt you. So that's going to be more of a long-term thing. So for now, not too much of an issue, but getting into 2025, 2026, that'll probably start showing a little more. It's not going to be decisive. It's not going to be enough to force Russia to stop fighting, but it is going to be a drag on economic activity, and it'll be more and more of a drag over time. So they will have an incentive and more of an incentive to stop fighting. It just won't be a decisive incentive.
Low to medium incentives. Chat getting hostile. Yeah, Israel-Palestine. A lot of people can't help themselves because the information that's served is very aggressive. It's very much so like stand up for this issue or you're a bad person. So it's a very threatening stance, which is interesting because the situation has existed for a really long time, but it wasn't served to Americans in social media until pretty recently. So it's one of those hot and fresh issues that a lot of people have very angry takes on. The sobering angle for me as a person, whenever people are getting really angry about Israel-Palestine, is to think about the number of normal citizens that are in both of those demographics of Israeli and Palestinian. The militaries are involved in a lot of stuff. The governments are involved in a lot of stuff. The average person, like you've got bakers, you've got school teachers, you've got firefighters, you've got doctors, you've got standard normal working people, which makes it a lot harder to hate a group overall. Like if you want to call out the issues with administration, knock yourself out. But as soon as someone starts talking about nationalities of people as being good or bad, that's when you're just cheering for a sports team at that point. You've lost your ability to reason and think through the situation. Obviously, it's not a good situation that's happening over there for sure. And if you want to weigh in, you can. Just be really careful with the amount of anger that you let kind of stew around with yourself based on what you can actually do. Like for a person who's in the US, to me it seems like you're too far away to do that much of major note in the conflict. Like you can talk about it, but sending money over there is pretty much always going to be a minus just because you don't really know where that money's going to be going. And then posting about it is really weird because both sides have an enormous amount of blood on their hands.
Yeah.
So you're like, you're going to be supporting killers over here or killers over there. Obviously, yes, there's an underdog, but that underdog status depends on your frame of reference, because if you're looking at the nation of Israel, yes, the Palestinians are the underdog. If you're looking at the kind of region of the world over there, the Israelis are sort of their own underdog, because they're surrounded by a bunch of nations that are predominantly Muslim, and many of them really don't like that nation was established. So they're forced into a defensive position. So everyone has a reason to have a gripe. That's why I feel like try to be measured and try to be calm with the way that you talk with people about it, and know that a lot of people have been served very heavy and dank propaganda over long periods of time.
Yeah.
And they don't necessarily really hate you. They just really like the way that their righteous anger makes them feel. But they're not aware of it in that sense. They really feel like if you don't repost this Instagram post of Palestine, then you're a bad person. That's exactly the same thing as chain emails were way back in the day. I don't know if you remember those of like, there's going to be a spooky ghost that appears in your room at 3 a.m. if you do not send this email to 10 people. And it's like, well, shit, I don't want a spooky ghost in my room. Better send this to a few people just in case. Or for stuff like these political and social issues, it might be like, well, if I don't post this, are people going to think I'm supporting bad people or on the wrong side of history? There's a lot of pressure that's put on us that, in a sense, is unjustly put on us, where it's not actually our responsibility or our battle. So try to piece things together using your best judgment if you can.
If you can.
If you can.
That's maybe expecting too much of the internet.
Yeah, but this chat is pretty smart.
True.
I give this chat a lot more credit than the average
Fair
web
point.
user. Good job, chat. Keep it up.
Yeah, I was expecting a lot more hostile comments on the last YouTube video, given that we talked about color revolutions. Lots of people have strong opinions about that.
A lot of them, though, just never really hit our news cycle anyway, so they don't even know about them.
True.
I appreciate you
definitely-
refreshing us with news that isn't on the main US channels, because that's all we get. Like, whenever I'm out and I see news, like, it's usually those, not to be too insulting, but it's lowbrow, high emotion, high drama news, where they're not really scooping the most impactful stuff that's going to have knock-on effects over the long term that you could make decisions based on. It's like, this politician said this dumb shit, and now this is happening, maybe. And you're kind of speculating on maybes of the different bullcrap that people said. And it's exciting because you're looking at it like, oh, maybe something big is going to happen this time. Or maybe not. Find out. They had the Trump hush money case stuff on the gym TVs pretty much constantly for the past week.
Oh, God.
Yep.
I'm sure it was very invigorating during your workouts, right?
Super insightful.
How does one misappropriate funds to pay off a porn star?
Very
Yeah,
carefully.
problems- Very carefully. There you go. Kind of problems that every man faces at some point in his life.
Wow.
What, you've never paid off a porn star to keep quiet about your sexual liaisons?
No.
I've lost count of mine. Gosh.
Wow. Agent Smith. The Bond supervillain. Let's go. I could see it.
Something might be wrong with your vision.
Chat doesn't know what you look like at all. I haven't seen you in fucking like 12 years. It's really funny that we've maintained our correspondence and our friendship over this amount of time, but none of it has been in person. Thank you, internet.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah, I've still got that gift I got you in China
Oh, yeah.
5 years ago.
We're going to be heckin' sitting in lawn chairs 78 years old, and you're gonna be like, oh shit, and I'm gonna be like, what? And you'll be like, oh, I forgot. And then you'll be like, oh shit, and you'll be like, what? I got you that gift from China. And I was like, oh, where is it? You're like, I don't know.
Well, right now I look like a Buddhist monk.
Cool. What is your wisdom for the chat as a Buddhist monk today?
You know, if you're working on a PhD and you're all but dissertation, Finish your fucking dissertation. That's my advice. Whatever else is going on in your life, it's not as important as that. So focus. Get your shit together.
I like that. Focus, get your shit together, finish the job. He's learning.
Yeah, I'm learning, but I'm learning the hard way, and that's not the most efficient way to learn.
Yeah, but it's the most long-term concrete way to learn.
True.
It's really hard to follow advice that other people just tell you. You know, you should really do this. Fucking nobody listens to that at all. Not a single person. But making the mistake for yourself, yeah, that'll stick. Because then you have things like embarrassment, guilt, humiliation, and shame as your guideposts.
Yeah. Yep. You got the scars to show for it to remind you for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. What else did I have for this week? There's going to be 2 presidential debates in June. Did you hear about that?
Oh, no.
Yeah. I guess that's this month, right? Yeah.
Yep. This is June.
Yeah, so they're going to be a little bit early this year.
How
Or
many
this
IQ points do you
election.
think the average viewer will lose from watching it?
Oh, man. It depends on how inebriated they get over the course of the debate. I suspect, given how dumb it's going to be, they're going to be very inebriated. So your brain cells will be in danger, Neuro.
Save yourself.
Yeah.
Stay safe, chat.
Yeah, I mean, people are going to watch it. It'll be highly watched
Yeah.
because it's going to be like some kind of what was his name? P.T. Barnum, right? It's going to be like presidential debates as produced by P.T. Barnum, because Trump and Biden are just characters unto themselves, and watching them to debate is going to be like watching some kind of freak show at P.T. Barnum Circus. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of interest just for that reason. You know, what are they going to say? What's Trump going to say? What's he going to do? You know what else is interesting about these debates? They're not actually going to be hosted by the people that have been hosting them for the past like 40 years. Neither campaign was willing to agree to that. Actually, I think it was mostly Trump's campaign, but in the end, they ended up negotiating a debate forum that was going to be managed by somebody else. I don't remember who. But it's going to be managed in a different way this time. So this will be a first. Whether that's good or bad remains to be seen, but you'll have to tune in to find out.
Yeah, it's a pretty tough job. I feel like no one wants that job.
Being president or moderating a presidential debate.
Moderating a presidential debate specifically with these individuals.
Yeah.
I guess
Yeah, that's-
Biden isn't really that weird. It's just he's kind of boring.
Yeah. Very much so. He has to be.
I don't really watch much of Biden's stuff. But
You're not
people
missing
usually
too
talk
much.
about how old he is. Super old.
He does come across that way as you watch him. It's kind of gotten worse over time. Given his age, that's not that surprising in the grand scheme of things.
Let Joe Rogan be the moderator. Oh my gosh. He invited Terrence Howard onto his podcast. And this gentleman, or person, they are trying to reinvent math in some ways. They believe that 1 times 1 equals 2.
Uh-huh.
And they're working with this as a baseline for a lot of different theories, such as reinventing the periodic table and inventing entire branches of mathematics. He was so smart that even in the womb, he was starting to invent different branches of mathematics, which is pretty impressive. This is all self-report, though, so
Of course.
make of this what you will.
Naturally.
Yeah. But Joe
I think
Rogan,
I-
being the very shrewd informational broker who he is, was really sure to kind of break down this stuff.
Well, I would hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could have sworn I saw people arguing about that on Twitter. Because he posted something about... Yeah, somebody posted a clip of that interview, that segment, where he was talking about how elements on a periodic table have sounds.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that made the rounds. That had a lot of people
Yeah.
calling him an idiot, basically. Just completely talking out of his ass. And then there was a bunch of people that came and tried to defend him.
Mm-hmm.
They were saying, you're just not being open-minded enough. And then a bunch of physicists came in and were like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Yeah, the thing that he does that I guess the closest person I can think of is Deepak Chopra.
Yeah.
He's the kind of person who will take a word from each branch of science, take a word from religion, and then another word from like lifestyle stuff. And he'll put all of those words into a blender, and then he'll give you a very impressive smoothie with his degrees attached to it. So you have to be wary of that, especially when people use a bunch of smart sounding words in a row. They're oftentimes doing this without giving a clear explanation of the steps as you're going along the way. They'll just assume that you're gonna agree with them and believe the kind of stuff that they're saying. So pretty interesting stuff. You have to be careful. They will sell you strange bullshit.
Strange, exotic bullshit.
Yeah. And they'll also, this is kind of similar to one of the things that he does, they'll pitch it in such a way that other people won't believe this because it's bad for their careers, if I'm right. Which is technically true, but they'll use that as a reason to say that that means that I'm true because they oppose my ideas. Which is silly. So yeah, I did a 10-minute video breaking down his silly math thing a while back, and then for this one it was just like so much unnecessary information that wasn't really related to the question at hand. Like, what are you trying to solve here? Why are we involving sound and light information into this discussion about the number of atoms in stuff? Just seemed overly complicated to me.
Very much so. That was my impression as well.
Yep. Kind of funny, though, if you want to see something that's interesting. It kind of makes you wonder, like, wow, I can't believe he actually tried to argue for this, but he did.
Hey, whatever works. You don't have to convince everybody.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to convince enough people to make money off of them.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like robocalling, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to con everybody you call. It's enough if you just con maybe 1 out of every 10,000.
Mm-hmm.
If you call like 100,000 people, that's pretty decent money, even if it's only a handful that you actually get.
Mm-hmm.
So, cons in general kind of work like that. Or certainly for this guy. Have you ever heard of New Caledonia?
New Caledonia? No, what's that?
It's an island in the Pacific. It's its own territory, and it belongs to France. Yeah, it's one of a handful of French overseas territories in the Pacific Ocean. I think the other ones are French Polynesia, which you've probably heard of.
Mm-hmm.
Wallis and Futuna, which you probably have not heard of. I don't think anybody's heard of Wallis and Futuna. Those are 2 very small islands. And then I think that's pretty much it, other than New Caledonia. Those are the 3 main ones that France has over there. And New Caledonia is actually a pretty decent-sized island. I think it's maybe roughly the same size as Fiji. But nobody pays much attention to it, because nothing really much happens there that attracts international media anyway. But it was in the news a week or 2 ago because there were a bunch of protests that broke out. And those protests had to do with the reform to the electoral law there that would have allowed a lot of, how do you put it? I don't want to say foreigners per se. It would have extended the vote to people who had only been living there for 10 years. And that's relevant because about 40% of the population is native, and a lot of them would like independence rather than just being a French territory. But the problem they have is that, a majority of the population is not native. A lot of them are ethnic French or some other ethnic group. And most of them want to stay a part of France. So any effort to change who can vote in New Caledonia is invariably going to influence it's going to influence the outcome of these elections in New Caledonia. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I should mention that there have been multiple referendums in New Caledonia about whether or not the territory should become independent or should remain part of France. So that's why the natives, that is to say the non-French population in New Caledonia, is so sensitive about voting rights. Because if you give more rights to people who have only been living there for 10 years, as opposed to other groups like the French who have been there for a very long time, then that obviously means that you're favoring recent migrants who are disproportionately non-native and are probably going to disproportionately vote for the territory to remain part of France. So, I think I might be getting it a little... I might not be describing the reform that well, but the gist of it is that the native population is upset because the electoral reform is going to make it harder, not easier, for them to win a potential future independence referendum. That's the gist of it. So there were mass protests, there were riots, buildings burned, towns burned, cars were burned. It was a pretty dramatic event for the people on the island. I think there were a few foreign nationals who ended up getting evacuated by their governments. But I think things have cooled off since then. It's not an ongoing thing. President Macron, whose name I'm almost certainly mispronouncing again. There's always somebody in chat who points it out, and correctly so. Do try to keep me honest. I just struggle with his name in particular for some reason. President Macron did go to New Caledonia after the riot started, and he has announced that the reform is going to be put on hold. It has not been canceled, but it's not going to be moved forward in the near term. So this could come up again later on, but for now it's on the back burner. It seems like they're going to go into the next elections without the reform.
Just pulled up the map here where it is. So it is to the east of Australia, kind of New Zealand, Australia. It's a little bit of a triangle between the two. So it's in the Coral Sea. Relatively large, like not as big as New Zealand, obviously, but as far as these small island chains are concerned, it's a pretty big one.
Yeah, for what it is, decent sized.
Mm-hmm. Let's say the population.
It's not that big. Pretty small.
There's a barrier reef around the main island.
Yeah, it's a nice place to live.
Yeah. Looks really fancy. Only thing about being out here is it's very remote. It's hard to get to the main high population centers.
Very far away. Certainly very far away from France.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's a lot going on there other than like tourism and fishing, as I understand it. So they don't really get the benefits that, say, French Guinea gets from remaining a part of France. French Guinea is where France, actually, as well as the European Space Agency, launches most of their rockets. So French Guinea, if nothing else, benefits from being a major center of the space industry. Which is probably not the correct name for it, but that's what I'm going with. But New Caledonia doesn't really have an equivalent to that. So there's not as much tying them to France, economically speaking, other than the transfers that France sends to the island. And obviously, a lot of the native population doesn't really appreciate having such a large influx of outsiders come into the territory. They would prefer if they would have control over the territory themselves again, so that they could do with it what they will. But as is, their community is getting to be a smaller and smaller portion of the population, so it's getting less and less likely, given facts on the ground, that they'll ever be able to do that.
Chat saying they have a big deposit of nickel or something.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Some strategic critical mineral, as they've come to be called. Yeah, I think the protests disrupted the commodities market for that material. I think it was nickel, might have been something else, but that was in the news a little bit. But given that the riots only lasted for like, what, a couple days, if that, things have calmed down. So I imagine markets have corrected since then. Yeah, there's a lot of critical minerals in Australia, in particular. So, if we ever get cut off by China from certain critical minerals or rare earths or what have you, there's going to be plenty in Australia that the United States could buy. The problem is not really the minerals themselves. The problem is the refining of the minerals.
Yeah, which is very polluting, I heard.
Well, not just that it's polluting, but the Chinese market share in the refining of the materials is actually way, way higher than the production of the minerals themselves. So, it's relatively easy, emphasis on relatively, to start up a new mine and start extracting minerals from the grounds. If we really need to, we can expand existing mines or build new ones, and build new ones, in order to increase the supply of critical minerals and rare earths minerals that are needed for Western industries, U.S. industry, Australian industry, what have you. It would still probably take like 5 to 10 years to really do that, but it would be doable. We would be able to get through it. But the trouble would be if China cut us off from their refiners, we would be very hard pressed to come up with a alternative in even a medium term scenario. Short term, we would be pretty well screwed. In the medium term, still screwed. Over the long term, maybe. Presumably, given enough time, we could eventually develop the industries and facilities and technologies that are necessary to refine these materials. But right now, those are all thin on the ground in the United States and in the rest of the West. So it has the potential to be quite traumatic if things come to that, as far as the supply of critical minerals and refined critical minerals in particular, which are needed in modern advanced industries, particularly the tech industry.
Who are the other countries who do that? I know you said China's by far in the front.
I mean, there's hardly any. I mean, when I say China is by far the lead, I'm talking like 90% market share.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah. They have something like circa 90% market share in the refining of every rare earth and a number of critical minerals. So it's not just like a few or like 60 or 70% market share. It's extremely high, and it's extremely high across the board. So pollution is definitely a factor, like you mentioned, but that was a factor that mitigated the growth and eventually undercut Western refiners and allowed China to move into that space and dominate it almost completely. The United States has some, maybe Europe has some refiners, but all of them are pretty small niche producers. They don't have anything like the scale that China has. And I would point out, too, that Chinese producers have been producing at such scale for so long that they've actually gotten to be much more efficient. The longer you manufacture something, the more ways you find to produce it more efficiently. That's just part of learning. You learn on the job, and you find little new tricks, new innovations that improve the process. That's one of the significant disadvantages you face when you're not manufacturing something. You may be able to start manufacturing it relatively quickly if you can get the right equipment, but you're not going to have the benefit of decades of experience of producing it that gives you special insights into how to produce it more efficiently. So almost always, new producers are less competitive than existing producers for that reason.
Makes sense.
So go ahead.
Makes sense. It's hard to catch up.
Yeah. So even if we start producing and refined, critical minerals and rare earths minerals and scale up existing production, we're still going to be behind by like a generation because we don't have nearly the expertise or even necessarily the technology that Chinese producers have developed over time. So that's a key weakness on the part of the West, a critical choke point that China could exploit. Fortunately for the West, there's other choke points that benefit the West over China. So at this point, there's kind of a balance of terror that prevents relations from spiraling out of control and wrecking the global economy. So it's not too much of a problem in the short term, but if there were an unexpected event, for example, at some point, it could end up becoming a problem in the short term. Unexpectedly. So in that case, everybody is screwed, even though that's not what they wanted.
They can't screw with us because then they get screwed by this other thing over here.
Yeah, China still imports a lot of semiconductors, for example. They're producing more. They are working on their own, but they're not as advanced. And even in terms of less advanced semiconductors, they actually still import quite a bit. So that would be a problem for their overall economy and in particular for a lot of their more advanced manufacturing. They're also pretty dependent on a lot of software that comes from the West. I imagine they would be able to come up with alternatives to that eventually, but in the short term, being completely cut off from new updates, and new critical software that's been developed, that would probably sting in the short term, especially. Those are some of the main ones I'm remembering off the top of my head. But yeah, the takeaway is that for now, there's a rough balance. We'll see how long it lasts and whether or not it even matters. People can do dumb things.
Mm-hmm. We got about another 15 minutes. I don't know what else
15 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I had a story that I thought you might like. We've talked before about corruption in the United States. And we've talked before about how a lot of that corruption is kind of borderline legal because it comes in the form of the revolving door, right? You have a position in government, and then when you leave, you get a job with a company, and then that ends up being obviously benefiting you financially, especially if the job doesn't actually require you to do anything. So the expectation that there is a job waiting for you at this, that, or the other company after you leave your position, whether it be a retirement or some other reason, that influences decision-making unduly. And that itself is a major source of corruption in American government. So there's not a lot of people that have been nailed for doing that. Because again, it's very difficult to prove intent. Like, did you make this decision in your capacity as some kind of official officer of government because you expected to get a job later with some company because you made that decision? Or did you make that decision because you just genuinely thought that was the best decision? There's so much ambiguity in that question that it's very difficult to nail people who are just very actively trying to get jobs after they retire, to the point where it's a de facto bribe. But recently, actually just yesterday, I heard a story that somebody had been not convicted, but rather was being tried for that. And I haven't heard the details of the case yet, but I would be very interested in seeing how the government even found out about it. Because, you can be very quiet about these things. You don't even necessarily have to meet with officials of the company. It can be enough just to see other former retired officers getting jobs there to make you think that if you, play ball, so to speak, that you too could get a job there. But something happened here where prosecutors in the Justice Department felt that they could move forward with a prosecution. And in this case, it's actually a retired 4-star admiral. He was arrested because, supposedly, again, these are all allegations, supposedly because he agreed to award a government contract to a company in exchange for a future job with the firm. That's a quote from the article. His name was Robert Burke, and he was vice chief of naval operations up until 2022, so relatively recently. They also arrested 2 business executives of the firm that is alleged to be involved. And the detail of the plan is that the company had agreed to hire him after his retirement in 2022 with an annual salary of $500,000 and a grant of 100,000 stock options. And again, all allegations, the quid pro quo involved the vice admiral in question awarding a contract that was worth $355,000. It was a contract that involved the training of naval personnel, and the contract was issued in 2021. And apparently the company had actually had the contract before, but lost it 2 years previous, in 2019. So again, I don't have further details beyond that. But if they do actually get this guy, it does raise the question of whether they could use the same method on other people, because there's a lot of this going on. It's kind of just received wisdom that this is pretty ubiquitous in Washington. But again, it's just very difficult to prosecute by nature, just by dint of how difficult it is to prove that this kind of arrangement was made and that decisions involved were intentionally made in service of these kinds of agreements. But in this case, it seems the Justice Department is pretty confident. So we'll see just what the actual evidence is. If I had to guess, I would say this is not going to be like some kind of major sea change. I suspect here that probably the parties involved did something stupid, unusually stupid, that kind of got them caught. So I imagine most people engaged in this kind of activity are probably pretty smart about covering their tracks. Because again, I have to think it's relatively easy. So probably even if they do get this guy and convict him, it's probably not going to represent a significant change. But if there is some kind of new methodology here that they used in order to uncover this kind of conspiracy, that could be significant if that is the case. It all just depends on what kind of evidence they have and how they got it. So, again, remains to be seen. But, may be worth keeping an eye on this if you are interested in corruption in American politics. Perhaps corruption in the U.S. military in particular, which perhaps has a disproportionate share given how big it is.
Chat saying throwing away your job for 300K is so little.
Well, 300K was the contract, right? So, the admiral would have gotten considerably more than that if the deal had gone through. He would have had a job with $500,000 in salary and then all the perks in the form of stock options. If you're talking in terms of the executives, then yeah, they kind of... Well, I mean, even then, the contract is only worth 300K, but they may get paid more than that because the company probably has a whole bunch of other contracts on top of that. And there may be rewards for getting new contracts that would trigger things like stock options or what have you in their contract. So, it's not necessarily the case that 330 plus K was the value of the contract in question to the executives. There may have been other factors at play motivating them. But yeah, I mean, it is a pretty risky endeavor to engage in. But again, you can't blame them. Like, so many people get away with it so often. Like, why not you?
Mm-hmm.
You really got to start convicting these people if you really want to stop it. But it's just difficult. Like, how do you stop people from engaging in these sorts of implicit understandings? It's not even like a quid pro quo deal that you shake a hand over. It's more just understood that if you do this, then you get rewarded with that. Mm-hmm. And that's a much more difficult thing to change. That almost requires a cultural change within the government and with people who work for it. And you can't really change culture easily. That's not a switch that you can flip. That's just something you have to cultivate over time.
Yeah, you have to make it seem like it's a bad idea for the person to take the deal because it's not good. Whereas in this current context, a lot of people, they'll break the rules and be corrupt, and it makes them feel clever, like they're outsmarting the system and getting what they deserve because other people do that too.
Yeah, adjusting expectations. That would be another way of putting it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, since we're almost out of time here, we can maybe tack on a couple weird news items. These are always stupid. And for some reason, there was a couple of them this past week. I have an older one to start with, though. Do you remember that guy from Texas who went to Ukraine in 2014 and fought with the Donbass separatists?
Yeah, I heard about that.
Yeah. So then he kind of disappeared for a while after that, and then when Russia invaded Ukraine in 22, he popped up again. There was a new video of him kind of hanging around some of these Russian soldiers. And it wasn't clear just if he was involved in the army or not, but he was very clearly there and very clearly was supporting the Russians. So, for those of you not familiar with this guy, he's from Texas. He dresses like a cowboy, and he's a communist. It's a very unusual figure, and he traveled to Russia in 2014 to fight with the separatists in Ukraine. Sorry, he traveled to Ukraine in 2014 to fight with the separatists there, and has been backing Russia ever since. So the news about him that came out a couple months ago is that he died, supposedly in Ukraine. Supposedly because some Russian soldiers found him and mistook him for an American spy.
Oh no.
And then killed him.
Oh no.
Yeah. And even weirder was the way that they killed him. Supposedly, again, I mean, who knows really what happened, but what I was reading is that he was raped to death by these Russian soldiers.
The fuck?
That's what I said. So, this guy's story was already very weird, but now it has a very weird ending to go with it. I guess appropriately so. Regardless of how he died, though, he is dead. That much has been confirmed.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the universals of dying.
Yeah. So that's set in stone.
Jeez.
But yeah, there was a number of Ukrainians kind of chortling about it, about what a dumbass the guy was for coming there in the first place, and then fighting with the Russians.
Yeah, that's why it seems kind of weird to have someone who's American and like stereotypically and culturally American, when we associate a lot of that with patriotism, which is for your own country and against your enemies. And ever since the Cold War, Russia has kind of been our main enemy when it comes to throwing around force for military weight and so on.
Well, not since the Cold War ended. Relations were well, maybe not very good, but pretty good in the 90s. And a public service announcement for anybody like this guy: Russia's not communist anymore. Just to be clear, there's not even really much residual communism left in Russia. So this is not your cause here. Like, if you really believe in communism, Russia's not the place to go. You're not going to find any there.
Where would you recommend someone go if they wanted some good communism?
Well, I guess whether or not there's any such thing as good communism is debatable, but if that is your bag, you do have places like Cuba, struggling a bit with its economy right now, partly because of sanctions, partly because of global inflation. So maybe not the first choice. Maybe a better choice would be something like Vietnam. The trouble with Vietnam, though, is the same trouble that China has, which is that it's not really communism so much as it is nationalism with communist characteristics. So you may not like it. In fact, you may find capitalism much more prominent in places like Vietnam and China now than any kind of recognizable communism. Laos is pretty similar in that regard. So your options are kind of limited as far as good communism. I guess there's always North Korea. That is a pretty accurate representation of Stalinism. So, if that's what you want, you can always go there. But keep in mind, they don't really like non-Koreans very much in North Korea. The state ideology in North Korea is not just communist. It's also thoroughly nationalist and more than a little bit racist. They do tend to kind of put the ethnic Korean on a pedestal, so to speak. So if you do go there, you may find yourself a kind of second-class citizen to a degree, unless you're in some kind of privileged position that the government wants to keep you in their good graces for. They've had American defectors to North Korea before that lived relatively well because they played ball with the government and played American characters in North Korean movies. But unless you can get that kind of arrangement, you're probably just going to end up like that kid who went to North Korea as a tourist and stole something and ended up in a prison camp and then dying later. Yeah, just because you're a communist doesn't mean Pyongyang is going to trust you. But if you want Stalinism, there you go. That's what it's like. So yeah, that's there's pretty much no other. Actually, there are no other communist states other than those: North Korea, China, Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba. And as far as I remember, that's it. Now, you've got some places where communists have some degree of influence, maybe even power, but there are no other countries that can be said to be ruled as communist countries like those are. The Communist Party, I think of India. India actually has two, but I don't remember which of the two it is. But one of them actually has consistently maintained power in one particular Indian state, that being Kerala. But they're not really like full-on communists, like vanguard of the revolution, we don't need democracy communists. They're pretty content to work within the confines of India's democratic institutions. So you may not entirely appreciate the lack of ideological zeal with that particular iteration of communism if you are a dyed-in-the-wool communist. But they are there. They do technically run the state in coalition. What else? I mean, there are violent Maoists in India too, but the government doesn't like them. So you probably won't last very long if you try to team up with them. What was the other one? There was another one. What was it? I think I had another example in mind, but I forgot it. It's on me. Oh, the Kurds. That's right. Yeah, like the Kurdish separatists in Turkey, the PKK. They're actually Marxists. Like big time Marxists. Their leader Öcalan is like has a cult of personality. I don't think they're as violent as Stalinists were, but their political ideology and their model of governance, like the structure of the party, is similar to that of the Stalinist era, of the Stalin era Bolsheviks. So Öcalan has a cult of personality. It's extremely hierarchical as an organization. And yeah, they're thoroughgoing socialists, which makes them pretty popular with the communist crowd. But, as is widely known, the Kurds are the largest ethnic group in the world to not have their own state. And being stateless means they're almost constantly under siege by this, that, or the other government of one sort or another. So you'll get to live your communist lifestyle, but you're going to live it in a pretty dangerous environment in a very dangerous part of the world.
Yeah, I just pulled up his Britannica page. It said he's the leader of the PKK, a military Kurdish nationalist organization, and he's considered a terrorist by many international intelligence agencies, and an enemy of the state by Turkey, which that makes sense. They don't want that to exist.
Yeah.
His surname means avenger in Turkish, and he's referred to by the nickname Apo, Kurdish for uncle. He's 76.
Yeah, he's been around a while. He's actually in prison. He's been in prison for like 30, 40 years or something. So those are your options.
Those aren't very good options. I think I'll pass.
Yeah, that's probably the move.
I'm not super into communism anyway. I feel like the human desire for more is stronger than anything that could force like even output for everyone. There are some people who are naturally more go-getting and some people who naturally don't care and they're not going to exert themselves. So a communist system is going to inherently piss off everyone who works hard, because they're going to feel like people who don't are going to be getting relatively more, and they are. It's kind of baked into the system. It's meant to be more forced fairness, is how I understand at least the end goal, but the execution of it has never worked so far, because the people at the top who decide how all these policies are put in, they ultimately have the power to be corrupt and to take whatever they want for themselves. So getting true communism to work, I think that was one of the fundamental flaws that a lot of the people who have been fanatic about communism didn't understand, was that it was designed for small, already developed countries. And basically none of those countries chose to go for communism. It was usually huge countries that were still developing that tried to take a stab at it. And then you get stuff like you said, where it's more Stalinism than communism, because it's not actually even trying to be communist anymore. It's more about the personality at the top and serving them.
Yeah, pretty much. The very few what would the word be? Very few of the ideological zealots survived the revolutionary phase that came before communists seized power in whatever country. They were generally a big part of the conflict, the revolution, the civil war that preceded the onset of communist rule. But generally what happened after is that a lot of those people ended up getting purged. The true believers are not the ones you really want around. You want the guys who are willing to play ball and do what you tell them to do. So generally there's one network that emerges, and then they eliminate the rivals of whatever kind they may be. Yeah, if you want workers' rights, or maybe even like workers' ownership of production, dictatorship is a bad choice. It is better to do it democratically. So democratic socialism is probably the better avenue there.
Mm-hmm.
It's not guaranteed to work, and you're definitely going to face significant barriers. But ultimately, you're probably more likely to achieve your end goal in that case than you are with Stalinist dictatorship or whatever equivalent you may be thinking about. Can you hear my root beer?
Yeah. What kind do you have?
Virgil's?
Virgil's.
Yeah.
Only black coffee and water for me lately.
That's good. That's better for you.
I do enjoy a good smoothie, though. Root beer floats were one of my favorite desserts growing up.
Huh.
It's got so much texture to it. Yeah, have you had that?
I don't think so.
Really? You haven't had a root beer float?
No, I don't think so.
Oh my god. Okay. It's really easy to do. Whenever you feel like splurging a little bit, this is super unhealthy, so don't have this every day. But you basically have a scoop of ice cream or two, and then just pour root beer over it. And it gives it a really nice, kind of almost a syrupy sweet flavor to the ice cream. But then also because it's carbonated, it has like a crackly poppy texture that ice cream doesn't normally have. Yeah, chat's freaking out now. They're saying, who robbed this man of his childhood? Agent Smith enjoys soda, enjoys ice cream, has not had a root beer float. There's a problem to solve. Normally I give you a push-up and a squat walk challenge. Figure out a root beer float. Chat, we should get this guy a root beer float.
I'll see what I can do. I didn't start drinking root beer until relatively recently. I found it pretty off-putting when I was a kid. So that was probably the barrier there.
Chad does
beer float.
Coke floats as well. Yeah, if I was going to a place now, I would prefer to get something like there's an Italian name for this, but you basically have a scoop of ice cream and you pour a couple shots of espresso over it. And it's a similar idea where you're adding flavors of a beverage to it, which you might enjoy. Chat saying brandy also works.
Brandy.
Brandy instead of root beer.
There you go. Well, unfortunately, I still don't drink alcohol. But if I did, I would give it a try.
Yeah, that's a good way to give your liver a break. Not drinking.
Yeah, my body needs a break. I put lots of other forms of stress on it. If you're going to have vices, it's best not to have too many at the same time.
That's true. Yep. Everyone has their vices. Have you seen Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood?
A lot of it. I haven't sat down and watched it front to back. It was something that I saw in the background
Oh, okay.
on TV when I was doing other things, dicking around on my computer as a kid, basically.
Yeah. Well, that's my number one top favorite anime, and I'm watching through it again with my girlfriend. And they have 7 characters that are each a representation of the 7 deadly sins. And it's a fun kind of conversation topic when you're meeting with people to kind of see what their vices are, which ones they struggle with or lean into in some sense. And one of the commentaries of the show is these sinful aspects of ourselves define us, and they're not necessarily bad at appropriate levels. Like gluttony, you do need to eat. So eating is important. Gluttony is the maximum excess of that, but you do need to eat something. So a drive for hunger is important for survival. Lust, for example, is something that we need as a drive to reproduce, but obviously that can be taken too far. Greed, pride, envy, etc., all the rest of them. So being able to track which ones represent you the most and to try to be balanced, but not overly balanced that you remove all fun from life. It's a tricky thing. We have a lot of different ways to treat ourselves now that we could not in the past. Say, blasting your brain with intense visual information that would not have existed in a state of nature. That's one thing to consider. Blasting your digestive system with sugars and calories that you would not be able to amass in the wild. That was one thing that Kukio taught me, which was like fruit juices and beverages have way more sugar in them per time that you ingest them than eating the fruit itself. So be careful. Watch yourself.
Very much so. Yeah, that food industry is crafty. You got to keep an eye on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're advertising all the time as well, which makes us hungrier because they're kind of priming us with those signals of, ooh, that looks tasty, when we wouldn't have looked at that otherwise. It's like a highway, but you're driving down the highway with pictures of burgers the whole way. Yeah. What are you going to think about? Obviously exactly. A burger. Well, cool. Thanks for coming on. Next week, we'll try to do some Baldur's Gate together. I don't think we've ever gamed. Have we gamed together in any sense?
Not on stream. When we were in the apartment, we played Endless Space.
Oh, yeah. We did a LAN campaign of that, right?
Yeah.
That was sick. Yeah, I forgot we did that.
Good reminder. That was the one where I renamed all of my planets.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was fun. But I think that was the only time, if I'm not mistaken.
That's a good game. You definitely need a certain type of group to be able to have the patience to do a turn-based 4X together.
Yeah, true. Right
now,
if you ever want to do that, we can do that too.
That would be
cool.
I'm
definitely down for BG3. I'm still not good at it, but if you want to give it a try, I'm definitely game.
Awesome.
Oh, before you go, have you ever played Alpha Centauri?
I don't think so. What is that?
That's another 4X game. And it's actually, I mean, everybody differs on what their favorite is or which one they think is the best, but a lot of people say, and I say, that Alpha Centauri is the best one.
Oh, it's Sid Meier's stuff.
Yeah, Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri. Excellent game. I just bought it on Steam recently. I had it before. I've played it intermittently for a couple of years now. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to get it on Steam just because that's a little easier to manage. And yeah, it's still a lot of fun. It lets you do a lot of things that you can't do in any other 4X builder even today. It's a lot of fun. Very cool. So that's a strong recommend. And you in particular would like it because the story, and it does have a story actually, unlike most 4X games, that is heavily defined by science fiction themes. Mm-hmm. And it's like hard sci-fi too. So I think you in particular would enjoy that.
Nice. I'll look it up on Steam. Appreciate the recommendation. I am trying out a bunch of different games through these subathon kind of things. So I played Street Fighter.
I'm sure everybody and their mother has a recommendation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I do like 4X and I haven't played it in a bit. It's a good genre to play when you're tired. I was kind of thinking about that as I go through my different rotation of games of StarCraft, Dota, and Baldur's Gate. StarCraft and Dota both punish you very hard with your results if you play while tired. But if you play a turn-based game, you can just take longer for each turn. And you do forget more stuff, but it's relatively more forgiving than playing a super fast-paced RTS-style thing.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah.
I would agree. But yeah, the Steam version is pretty cheap. I got mine on sale for like $2.
Nice. That's good.
Yeah.
Well, cool. You go take a root beer float quest, okay? I'm usually the voice of fitness and health, but I cannot believe you have not tried a root beer float at least once.
I'll find one.
Well, cool. Thank you, Fuzzy Cord, for handling questions. Thank you, chat, for participating in the discussion. And thank you once again, Agent Smith, for your expertise and wisdom. Chat, if we messed up anything, feel free to leave us a scathing review in the comments. And we will see you all on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah. Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG. Nice.